Standing in front of 200 industry professionals, holding the most prestigious award in architectural design, I could only think about 3 little faces in the audience. My nephews were clapping so hard their tiny hands must have hurt. Their eyes wide with something I'd never seen before when they looked at me: pride. Meanwhile, my sister Rebecca sat frozen in her seat, her face a canvas of shock and disbelief. Just 6 months earlier, she'd pointed at me during a family dinner and told those same children, "This is what failure looks like." I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The Henderson family had always been about appearances. Growing up in our pristine suburban home in Westfield, New Jersey, everything had to look perfect from the outside. Our mother, Patricia, made sure the lawn was manicured, the shutters were painted, and the family portrait was updated every 2 years. My older sister Rebecca embraced this philosophy wholeheartedly, while I seemed to stumble through life leaving a trail of what our family considered embarrassments. Rebecca was the golden child from day one. Valedictorian, prom queen, full scholarship to Princeton, married her college sweetheart Marcus right after graduation. By 25, she had a sprawling house in the best part of town, 3 beautiful boys, and a husband who worked in finance. She drove a pristine white SUV and hosted elaborate dinner parties where every detail was Instagram-worthy. I was the opposite of everything Rebecca represented. After barely graduating from a state school with a degree in architecture, I moved to a cramped studio apartment in Brooklyn and spent my days working for a small firm that specializes in affordable housing projects. While Rebecca was posting pictures of her granite countertops and walk-in closets, I was sketching designs for community centers in neighborhoods most people avoided. The contrast became even more stark when Rebecca's boys came along. Tyler, Mason, and Connor were her pride and joy, and she made sure they understood the importance of success, prestige, and maintaining the family reputation. At 7, 5, and 3 years old respectively, they already knew which brands were acceptable, which neighborhoods were good, and which relatives were worth bragging about at school. I wasn't one of them. The first crack in our relationship appeared during a family barbecue when Tyler was 4. He'd been playing with some toy buildings I'd brought him, constructing elaborate cities on the patio. When Rebecca saw him, she immediately redirected his attention to a soccer ball, explaining that building things is fine as a hobby, but real success comes from business and leadership. She glanced at me meaningfully as she said it, over the eye. Years, these little comments accumulated like water damage behind drywall. Rebecca would mention how some people are content with small dreams when discussing my career choice. She'd talk about how important it was for her boys to aim higher than just getting by whenever I visited. The most painful moments came when she'd use me as a cautionary tale during family gatherings. During one particularly memorable Christmas dinner, Rebecca was explaining to her mother-in-law why Tyler needed to focus more on his grades. "I just don't want him to end up like some people," she said, nodding in my direction, working for peanuts and living in tiny apartments because they didn't prioritize their education properly. I'd learned to bite my tongue during these moments. Confrontation had never been my strong suit, and part of me wondered if Rebecca was right. Maybe I had made poor choices. Maybe I was the family disappointment she seemed to think I was. The boys absorbed these messages without question. Tyler, the oldest, would ask polite questions about my work, but never showed real interest. Mason would change the subject whenever I mentioned my projects. Little Connor, the youngest, barely acknowledged my presence during visits, too busy showing off his expensive toys and talking about their family vacations to Disney World and the Hamptons. My apartment became a source of particular embarrassment for Rebecca. Located in a converted warehouse in Red Hook, it was small, but full of character. The exposed brick walls were covered with my architectural sketches and photographs of community projects I'd worked on. The space was cramped but functional, with a Murphy bed that folded down from the wall, and a tiny kitchen that I'd actually designed myself to maximize every square inch. When Rebecca finally visited after months of excuses, her reaction was immediate and harsh. "God, Emma, how do you live like this?" she said, picking her way carefully across the concrete floors. "It's so small and dark. Don't you want something better?" The boys were less diplomatic. "Why don't you have a real bedroom?" Tyler asked, loudly. "And where's your dining room? How do you eat dinner?" Rebecca didn't correct them or explain that different people have different living situations. Instead, she hurried them out after 15 minutes, claiming they needed to get home for soccer practice. As they left, I heard her tell Marcus on the phone, "You should see where she's living. It's worse than I thought." That visit marked the beginning of a more systematic campaign to establish me as the family failure. Rebecca began using my life choices as teaching moments for her children. When Tyler complained about his homework, she'd remind him that people who don't work hard end up living in tiny apartments and struggling to pay bills. When Mason wanted to quit piano lessons, she'd explain that giving up leads to having no options later in life, just like some people we know. The most devastating blow came during Tyler's 8th birthday party. Rebecca had gone all out, renting a country club and inviting what seemed like half the town. The other parents were discussing their children's achievements and future plans, the conversation naturally turning to college prep and career aspirations. "We're already looking at private high schools," Rebecca announced proudly. "I want the boys to understand that excellence isn't optional in our family." She paused dramatically, then added, "I've seen what happens when people settle for mediocrity, and I refuse to let my children go down that path." Several parents looked confused, so Rebecca elaborated. "My sister here is a perfect example," she said, gesturing toward me with her wine glass. "She chose the easy route in college, ended up in a dead-end job, and now she's 32 years old, living like a college student. I use her situation to teach the boys about making better choices." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt 20 pairs of eyes on me, some pitying, others judgmental. The worst part was seeing Tyler, Mason, and Connor absorbing every word. Tyler looked at me with something close to shame, as if he was embarrassed to be related to me. Mason wouldn't meet my eyes at all. Even little Connor seemed to understand that Aunt Emma was not someone to be proud of. I excused myself early that night, claiming I had work to finish. Rebecca didn't try to stop me or apologize for what she'd said. If anything, she seemed satisfied that her point had been made so clearly. The drive home to Brooklyn was one of the longest of my life. I kept replaying Rebecca's words, the looks, on people's faces, and worst of all, the way my nephews had reacted. These children who used to hug me when I arrived and beg for piggyback rides now saw me as a cautionary tale, a representation of everything they should avoid becoming. That night, alone in my small apartment, I looked around at the space I'd once been proud of. The architectural drawings that had seemed like artwork now looked like amateur sketches. The compact, efficient design I'd been pleased with felt cramped and sad. Maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe I had settled for less than I deserved. But something else stirred in me that night, something that had been dormant for too long. As I sat at my drafting table, looking at the plans for a community center in the Bronx that would provide after-school programs for 200 kids, I realized something important. My work mattered. The buildings I helped design weren't glamorous, but they changed lives. The affordable housing projects I worked on gave families safe places to call home. The community centers became gathering places where neighborhoods could come together. Rebecca's definition of success was narrow and hollow. Her pristine house and expensive cars were impressive, but what had she actually built? What had she created that would outlast her? Her children were growing up believing that worth was measured in square footage and brand names, that people like me were failures because we chose purpose over profit. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of defiance. Maybe I was living in a small apartment and driving an old car, but I was building something that mattered. My projects were featured in architectural journals, not because they were luxurious, but because they were innovative solutions to real problems. I'd won small awards before, recognition from community organizations and design publications, but I'd never made a big deal about them because they seemed insignificant compared to Rebecca's version of success. The next morning, I decided to stop apologizing for my choices. When my supervisor mentioned that our community center design had been nominated for the Thornton Award, the most prestigious recognition in socially conscious architecture, I didn't brush it off like I usually did. Instead, I threw myself into the presentation, determined to show that small, purpose-driven projects could compete with the flashy commercial developments that usually won these competitions. The Thornton Award wasn't just about recognition. It came with a $50,000 grant to fund future projects and guaranteed media attention that could launch a career. More importantly, it represented validation that the work I'd been doing mattered, that choosing purpose over prestige wasn't the same as choosing failure. As I worked on refining our proposal, I couldn't stop thinking about Tyler, Mason, and Connor. They were growing up believing that their aunt was a disappointment, that anyone who didn't live in a big house and drive a luxury car had failed at life. I wanted them to understand that success could look different, that building something meaningful was just as valuable as accumulating expensive possessions. But I also knew that Rebecca would never allow that conversation to happen. In her mind, I was a cautionary tale, and she intended to keep using me that way. The only thing that might change her perspective was the kind of success she could understand. Public recognition, prestige, and yes, money. The Thornton Award. Ceremony was still 4 months away, but I'd already started imagining what it would feel like to prove Rebecca wrong. Not just for my own sake, but for my nephews, who deserved to know that there were many different ways to build a meaningful life. The weeks following my decision to pursue the Thornton Award seriously transformed my daily routine completely. I arrived at the office before sunrise, staying long after my colleagues had gone home to their families. The community center project consumed every spare moment, but for the first time in years, the exhaustion felt purposeful rather than defeating. My supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, had been skeptical when I first mentioned wanting to submit for Thornton. She'd worked in affordable housing design for 15 years and seen plenty of talented architects burn out chasing prestigious awards that seemed designed for firms with unlimited budgets and flashy portfolios. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Emma, you know these competitions usually go to the big names, she said during one of our late-night work sessions. Foster, Gary, those kinds of firms, they submit projects with million-dollar budgets and celebrity clients. That's exactly why we need to try, I replied, spreading out the latest revisions across her desk. Someone needs to show that architecture can serve communities, not just egos. The project we'd submitted was a community center in the South, Bronx, designed to replace a crumbling building that had served the neighborhood for 40 years. The original structure was beyond repair, but the community couldn't afford to lose the services it provided. Our design incorporated sustainable materials, flexible spaces that could serve multiple functions, and innovative solutions that maximized impact while minimizing cost. What made our project special wasn't its size or budget, but its integration with the community it served. We'd spent months in neighborhood meetings, listening to residents describe what they needed. Elderly community members wanted a safe space for daily activities and health services. Parents needed after-school programs and tutoring help for their children. Teenagers craved somewhere to gather that wasn't a street corner. Our design addressed all these needs through adaptable spaces that could transform throughout the day. The main hall featured movable walls that created separate areas for different age groups. The roof included a garden where residents could grow vegetables, both feeding families and teaching children about nutrition. Solar panels would make the building energy independent, with excess power sold back to the grid to fund programs. Most importantly, we'd designed the building to be constructed using local labor, training community members in sustainable building techniques they could use to improve their own homes. The project wasn't just about creating a building. It was about empowering a neighborhood to invest in its own future. As our submission took shape, I found myself working with an intensity I hadn't felt since college. The technical drawings had to be perfect, but we also needed to tell the story of why this project mattered. The presentation portfolio grew to include interviews with community members, environmental impact studies, and detailed financial projections showing how the design would save money over decades of operation. Meanwhile, Rebecca's campaign to establish me as the family failure continued with renewed vigor. During a family dinner in March, she announced that Tyler had been accepted into an exclusive summer program for gifted students. The cost was astronomical, but Rebecca declared it essential for his future. "Some people might think it's too expensive," she said, glancing meaningfully at me. "But Marcus and I believe in investing in excellence. We're not willing to settle for mediocre opportunities just because they're cheaper." Tyler, now 8 years old, had internalized these lessons completely. When our mother asked him about his favorite subjects in school, he responded with rehearsed precision. "I like math and science because they lead to important careers. I don't want to end up in a job that doesn't matter." The words stung, but they also strengthened my resolve. These children were being taught that value came only from wealth and status, that helping others was somehow beneath them. If I won the Thornton Award, maybe I could show them a different perspective. The preliminary judging took place in April. Out of 200 submissions from around the world, only 20 would advance to the final round. I'd tried to prepare myself for rejection, knowing that most winners came from established firms with international reputations. When Janet called me into her office that Friday afternoon, her expression was unreadable. "Emma, we need to talk about the Thornton submission." My heart sank. I'd spent months on this project, sacrificing sleep and social opportunities, pouring everything into a dream that was probably unrealistic from the start. "They announced the finalists this morning," Janet continued, her poker face finally cracking into an enormous grin. "We made it. We're in the final 20. The next few minutes were a blur of congratulations from colleagues who'd watched me obsess over every detail. For months. The office erupted in cheers, and someone produced a bottle of champagne that had been sitting in the break room refrigerator for years. But even in that moment of triumph, my first thought was about Tyler, Mason, and Connor. For the first time, in their lives, their aunt had achieved something that might impress their mother. Maybe this would be enough to change how they saw me. I called Rebecca that evening, hoping to share the news and perhaps bridge the gap that had grown between us. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. "Rebecca, I have some exciting news. My project was selected as a finalist for the Thornton Award. It's one of the most prestigious honors in architecture." There was a pause. "That's nice. Emma, what kind of prize do you get?" "Well, the winner receives $50,000 and recognition that could really advance my career. But more importantly, it means the work we're doing matters. This project will serve thousands of people in the Bronx." Another pause. 50,000? That's it? Marcus made more than that in bonuses last month. And the Bronx isn't exactly a prestigious location, is it? The conversation lasted only a few more minutes, with Rebecca quickly changing the subject to Tyler's summer program and Mason's soccer league. She didn't ask for details about the project or seem curious about what the award represented. To her, it was just another small achievement from her underachieving sister, not worthy of genuine interest or congratulation. That call crystallized something important for me. I wasn't pursuing this award to gain Rebecca's approval anymore. I was doing it to prove to myself, and eventually to my nephews, that success could be measured in ways she'd never understand. The final round of judging would take place at a ceremony in Chicago in late June. Each finalist would present their project to a panel of renowned architects, urban planners, and community development experts. The presentations were open to the public, and the winner would be announced that same evening. I spent the next 2 months refining my presentation, traveling back to the Bronx to document the community's involvement in the project. Mrs. Santos, an 80-year-old woman who'd used the old community center for decades, agreed to come to Chicago to speak about what the new building would mean to her neighborhood. Most people design buildings for people like themselves, she told me during one of our planning sessions. You listened to what we actually needed. That's why this matters. Her words reminded me why I'd chosen this career path in the first place. Architecture wasn't just about creating impressive structures. It was about understanding how spaces could improve people's lives. The fancy residential projects Rebecca admired might photograph well, but they didn't solve problems or strengthen communities. As the presentation date approached, I began to see changes in how my colleagues viewed me. Janet started including me in meetings with potential new clients, introducing me as the architect behind our Thornton finalist project. Other firms began reaching out, curious about our community-centered design approach. The attention was flattering, but it also highlighted how much my self-perception had been shaped by Rebecca's criticism. I'd been hiding my achievements, downplaying my contributions, allowing myself to be seen as the family disappointment because it was easier than defending my choices. 2 weeks before the ceremony, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I called Rebecca and invited her entire family to attend the presentation in Chicago. It would mean a lot to have the boys there, I explained. This is probably the most important professional moment of my career, and I want them to understand what I've been working toward. Rebecca was initially resistant. Chicago is expensive and the boys have summer activities. I'm not sure it makes sense to disrupt their schedules for something that might not even work out. Rebecca, I'm offering to pay for everyone's travel and hotel. This isn't just about winning an award. It's about showing Tyler, Mason, and Connor that there are different ways to be successful. After several days of consideration, she agreed, though her tone suggested she was doing me a favor rather than celebrating my achievement. Fine, we'll come. But don't get your hopes up too high. These things rarely work out the way people expect. Her words stung, but they also reminded me how much was at stake. This wasn't just about professional recognition anymore. It was about changing the narrative that had defined my relationship with my family for years. The presentation I'd prepared told the story of the South Bronx Community Center through the voices of the people it would serve. Instead of focusing on architectural theory or design innovations, I planned to show the judges how thoughtful design could address real social problems. Mrs. Santos would speak about the programming the center would offer. A local contractor would explain the job training opportunities the construction process had created. A teenager from the neighborhood would describe how the building's flexible spaces could adapt to serve his generation's changing needs. But I also knew the judges would want to see technical excellence. The drawings and models had to demonstrate that community-focused architecture could be just as sophisticated as any luxury development. Every detail, from the sustainable material choices to the innovative structural systems, needed to showcase professional competence. The week before the ceremony, I had one final conversation with Janet about strategy. You know, some of the other finalists have celebrity clients and unlimited budgets, she reminded me. How do you compete with that? By remembering that architecture is supposed to serve people, not just impress other architects, I replied. If the judges understand that, we have a real chance. As I packed for Chicago, I couldn't help thinking about the 8-year-old version of Tyler who used to ask me to help him build elaborate structures with his blocks. Somewhere along the way, Rebecca had convinced him that building things wasn't important, that only certain kinds of success were worth pursuing. Maybe this presentation wouldn't change his mind. Maybe Rebecca would find ways to diminish whatever happened in Chicago. But for the first time in years, I felt confident that I had something valuable to offer, something worth celebrating regardless of my family's reaction. The community center project represented everything I believed architecture could be: beautiful, functional, sustainable, and transformative. Whether or not I won the Thornton Award, I'd created something meaningful, something that would improve lives for decades to come. Rebecca might never understand that kind of success, but perhaps her children could learn to see beyond her narrow definitions. In just a few days, I'd have the chance to show them what their aunt had really been building all these years. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes when the architecture world's elite gather in one place. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables filled with internationally recognized designers, urban planning experts, and journalists from the most prestigious design publications. I stood at the edge of the reception area, watching these titans of the industry network effortlessly, their conversations peppered with references to projects I'd only read about in magazines. My family had arrived that morning, and the contrast between their expectations and the reality of the event was immediately apparent. Rebecca had packed what she clearly considered appropriate attire for a small professional gathering: business casual outfits that looked woefully underdressed among the designer suits and avant-garde fashion statements surrounding us. I didn't realize this would be so formal, she whispered to Marcus as we checked into the hotel. Her voice carried a note I'd rarely heard before: uncertainty. Tyler, Mason, and Connor were experiencing their own form of culture shock. The hotel lobby alone was more luxurious than anything in their suburban world, with its soaring ceilings, marble floors, and priceless artwork. 9-year-old Tyler kept staring at the architectural details, his engineering-focused mind clearly processing the structural elements he'd never noticed in buildings before. Aunt Emma, how did they make the ceiling so high without it falling down? He asked during our elevator ride to the rooms. It was the first technical question he'd ever asked me, and I found myself explaining the principles of load distribution and steel frame construction. For those few minutes, I saw a spark of the curiosity that Rebecca had been systematically discouraging, the same fascination with how things worked that had drawn me to architecture in the first place. The afternoon rehearsal went smoothly. Mrs. Santos had flown in from New York, and despite being nervous about speaking to such a distinguished audience, she practiced her remarks with quiet dignity. Her presence grounded me, reminding me that this wasn't about impressing industry celebrities. It was about representing a community that deserved better than they'd been offered. The other finalists were exactly what I'd expected: teams from globally recognized firms presenting museums, luxury residential developments, and corporate headquarters with budgets that exceeded our entire firm's annual revenue. During the technical run-through, I watched presentations featuring holographic displays, scale models that cost more than my car, and video productions that looked like Hollywood films. My presentation seemed almost quaint by comparison. We had hand-drawn sketches alongside computer renderings, a simple slideshow, and Mrs. Santos speaking from the heart rather than a scripted performance. But as I watched the other presenters practice, I noticed something interesting. Their presentations focused almost entirely on aesthetic achievements and technical innovations. None of them spent significant time discussing the human impact of their designs. That evening, Rebecca's attempts to network at the pre-ceremony cocktail hour were painful to watch. She approached conversations with her usual confidence, expecting to dominate through force of personality and social positioning. But among architects and urban planners, her standard talking points about real estate values and luxury amenities fell flat. "What kind of architecture does your husband do?" asked Dr. Patricia Chen, a renowned sustainable design expert, after Rebecca had spent 5 minutes discussing Marcus's finance career. "Oh, Emma's not married," Rebecca replied, missing the point entirely. She's focused on her career, though. It's been challenging for her to find the right opportunities. Dr. Chen looked confused. I meant your sister-in-law, the finalist. Her community-centered approach is fascinating. The integration of social services with sustainable design shows real innovation. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, Rebecca found herself in a conversation where she was the one who didn't understand the context. She spent the rest of the evening hovering near me, listening as colleagues and competitors discussed my work with genuine respect and professional interest. The boys were having their own revelatory experience. Connor, the youngest at 5, had gravitated toward a display of architectural models, studying them with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for video games. Mason struck up a conversation with the teenage son of another finalist, learning that the boy was already taking advanced math classes to prepare for an architecture program. But it was Tyler's reaction that surprised me most. During the cocktail hour, he approached me with uncharacteristic seriousness. "Aunt Emma, did you really design a whole building by yourself?" "Not by myself," I replied. "I worked with a team and we spent months listening to the community to understand what they needed." "Mom said you just draw pictures for work." The statement hung in the air between us, highlighting how thoroughly Rebecca had minimized my profession in her children's understanding. "Architecture is about solving problems," I explained. "We figure out how to create spaces that help people live better lives. The drawings are just one tool we use." Tyler absorbed this information quietly, then asked, "Is that why all these important people want to talk to you?" Before I could answer, the ceremony coordinator announced that it was time for the presentations to begin. The audience filed into the main ballroom, taking their seats at tables arranged around a central stage. My family sat at a table near the front, Rebecca's expression a mixture of pride and confusion as she began to grasp the significance of the event she'd initially dismissed. The presentations unfolded in alphabetical order, which meant I'd be going last. I watched as firm after firm showcased breathtaking designs, their presentations polished to perfection. A museum in Tokyo that seemed to float above the ground. A residential tower in Dubai that incorporated vertical gardens and sky bridges. A corporate campus in Silicon Valley that blurred the lines between indoor and outdoor spaces. Each presentation received enthusiastic applause, and I found myself questioning whether my community center could compete with such ambitious projects. These were architectural masterpieces that would be featured in textbooks and studied by future generations. My building was designed to serve a neighborhood most of these people had never visited, using modest materials and a budget that wouldn't cover the landscaping costs of the other projects. But then I remembered Mrs. Santos's words about listening to what people actually needed. These spectacular buildings were impressive, but did they solve problems? Did they strengthen communities? Did they make life better for the people who would use them every day? When my name was called, I walked to the podium with my presentation, materials, and looked out at the audience. 200 of the most influential people in architecture and urban planning were waiting to hear what I had to say. In the front row, Tyler, Mason, and Connor were leaning forward in their chairs, genuinely curious for the first time about their aunt's work. "Good evening," I began. "I want to tell you about a building that will never appear on magazine covers or win design awards for its aesthetic innovation. This is a building designed not to impress architects, but to serve a community that has been underserved for decades." I clicked to the first slide, showing the deteriorating community center that our project would replace. This is the South, Bronx, where 70% of residents live below the poverty line, where children walk past drug dealers to get to school, where elderly residents are afraid to leave their apartments after dark. The room grew quiet as I described the community meetings, the months spent listening to residents describe their needs and dreams. I showed sketches of children playing in unsafe lots, photographs of teenagers with nowhere to gather except street corners, images of elderly residents isolated in apartments because they had no safe community spaces. Traditional architecture asks, what can we build that will be noticed? Community-centered architecture asks, what can we build that will make a difference? Mrs. Santos took the stage to describe what the current community center meant to her neighborhood, her voice steady despite the intimidating audience. She talked about the after-school programs that kept children safe, the senior services that allowed elderly residents to age with dignity, the job training programs that had helped dozens of people find stable employment. This building isn't just about having a place to meet, she explained. It's about having hope. When you invest in a community, you tell people that their lives matter, that their children's futures matter. I returned to the podium to walk through the technical aspects of our design, the sustainable materials that would be manufactured locally, creating jobs while reducing environmental impact, the flexible spaces that could serve multiple functions throughout the day, the rooftop garden that would provide fresh food while teaching children about nutrition and environmental stewardship. This project cost less than the lighting system in some of the buildings you've seen tonight, I said, clicking a slide showing our budget breakdown. But it will serve thousands of people every year for generations to come. It will train local workers in sustainable construction techniques they can use to improve their own homes. It will generate enough solar power to fund its own programs, while selling excess energy back to the grid. The presentation concluded with testimonials from community members, each describing how the new center would impact their daily lives. A mother explained how the after-school programs would allow her to work full-time without worrying about her children's safety. A teenager talked about the music studio where he could record his compositions. An elderly man described the health services that would help him manage his diabetes. As I finished speaking, the applause that followed was different from what had greeted the other presentations. It wasn't just polite recognition of technical competence. It was the sound of people, genuinely moved by what they'd heard. The judges retired to deliberate while the audience mingled during a reception break. I found myself surrounded by architects and planners asking detailed questions about our community engagement process, our sustainability strategies, our approach to affordable construction. Several offered to collaborate on future projects. Rebecca stood nearby, listening to these conversations with growing amazement. Dr. Chen approached us during a lull in the discussions. "Your sister's work represents the future of our profession," she told Rebecca. "Too many architects design for other architects instead of for the people who will actually use the buildings. What Emma has done in the Bronx should be a model for community development everywhere." For the first time in our adult relationship, Rebecca looked at me with something approaching respect. The dismissive comments, the casual put-downs, the years of treating my career as a cautionary tale, all of it seemed to be reassessing itself in real time as she watched respected professionals discuss my work with genuine admiration. The boys were experiencing their own transformation. Tyler had spent the break asking detailed questions about sustainable construction, his engineering-focused mind clearly fascinated by the technical challenges we'd solved. Mason wanted to know about the community garden, curious about how architecture could incorporate food production. Even little Connor was excited about the playground equipment we'd designed specifically for the building. When the ceremony coordinator announced that the judges had reached their decision, the room fell silent. The presenter took the stage, holding an envelope that contained the name of the winner. This year's Thornton Award recognizes a project that exemplifies the highest ideals of our profession. The winning design demonstrates technical excellence, environmental responsibility, and above all, a deep understanding of architecture's power to transform communities. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Around me, the other finalists sat with carefully composed expressions, each probably running through acceptance speeches they'd prepared. The 2025 Thornton Award goes to Emma Henderson and the team at Rodriguez and Associates for the South Bronx Community Center. The explosion of applause that followed seemed to come from another dimension. People were standing, cheering, and through it all I could hear three small voices shouting louder than anyone else. Tyler, Mason, and Connor were on their feet, clapping with pure joy. their faces radiant with pride I'd never seen before when they looked at me. But it was Rebecca's reaction that truly stunned me. She was crying, actually crying, as she applauded. The sister who had spent years using me as an example of failure was weeping with pride as I walked to the stage to accept the most prestigious award in my profession. Walking across that stage, to accept the Thornton Award felt like moving through a dream. The crystal trophy was heavier than I'd expected, its weight somehow making the moment more real. As I looked out at the standing ovation, my eyes found my family's table first. Rebecca was still crying, her mascara streaking down her cheeks as she applauded with an enthusiasm I'd never seen from her before. Marcus looked genuinely shocked, as if he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about his sister-in-law. But it was the boys who filled my heart completely. Tyler pumping his fist in the air, Mason jumping up and down, and little Connor shouting, "That's my Aunt Emma!" at the top of his lungs. The acceptance speech I'd prepared flew out of my mind completely. Instead, I found myself speaking from the heart about Mrs. Santos and her neighbors, about the power of architecture to heal communities, about the responsibility we have as designers to serve people rather than just impress our peers. The audience listened with rapt attention, and when I finished, the applause seemed to last forever. The post-ceremony reception was a whirlwind of congratulations, interview requests, and business cards from firms wanting to discuss collaborations. Several major architecture publications requested exclusive interviews. A documentary filmmaker approached me about following the construction of the community center. Most importantly, 3 different community organizations from other cities wanted to commission similar projects. Through it all, Rebecca hovered nearby, no longer trying to insert herself into conversations but simply observing with wonder, as person after person praised my work and vision. Her usual confidence had been replaced by something I'd never seen before: humility mixed with genuine pride in her sister's achievement. "I had no idea," she whispered to me during a brief moment between interviews. "I never understood what you were really doing." The boys had their own revelations throughout the evening. Tyler cornered Dr. Chen, peppering her with questions about sustainable building materials and structural engineering. His 8-year-old mind was processing concepts that would challenge college students, but his enthusiasm made complex topics accessible. When she mentioned that many architecture programs now required courses in community engagement, Tyler announced that he wanted to learn about building things that help people. Mason discovered the photographer documenting the event and spent an hour learning about architectural photography. The man showed him how different angles could tell different stories about the same building, how lighting could emphasize certain design elements, how photography could help architects communicate their vision to the public. By the end of the evening, Mason was talking about maybe becoming an architectural photographer when he grew up. Even 5-year-old Connor found his own inspiration. Mrs. Santos had brought him a small sketch pad, and he spent the latter part of the reception drawing buildings with gardens on top, just like the community center design he'd seen in my presentation. His drawings were wonderfully childlike: houses with flowers sprouting from the roofs, apartment buildings with vegetable gardens climbing the walls. But they showed an understanding that buildings could be more than just structures. The flight home the next morning was unlike any family trip we'd ever taken. Usually, the boys would be absorbed in tablets or handheld games. Rebecca would be managing their schedules through her phone, and I would be reading or working on sketches. This time, the conversation never stopped. Tyler had filled a notebook with questions about architecture school, construction techniques, and environmental design. He wanted to know about every step of the design process, from initial community meetings to final construction. Most remarkably, he'd started thinking about how the principles we'd used in the Bronx could apply to his own suburban community. "Our school doesn't have any gardens," he observed. "And there's nowhere for teenagers to hang out except the parking lot behind the grocery store. Could someone design better spaces for our town too? Rebecca, who might have dismissed such questions a week earlier as impractical dreaming, found herself genuinely engaging with his ideas. Maybe when you're older, you could propose some improvements to the town council, she suggested. They're always looking for ways to make the community better. The transformation in Rebecca herself was the most remarkable change of all. The sister who had spent years minimizing my achievements now couldn't stop talking about the award ceremony. She'd taken dozens of photos and videos and was already planning how to share the news with friends and extended family. I keep thinking about what Dr. Chen said, Rebecca told me as our plane descended toward Newark, about how your work represents the future of architecture. I never realized how important what you do really is. More than her words, though, it was her tone that had changed. The condescension was gone, replaced by genuine curiosity about my work and respect for my expertise. For the first time in our adult relationship, she was listening to me rather than lecturing me. The changes became even more apparent once we returned home. Rebecca immediately called our parents to share the news, her voice bursting with pride, as she described the ceremony and the significance of the award. She posted photos on social media with captions celebrating my achievement, a stark contrast to the years when she'd barely acknowledged my career. But the most meaningful transformation was in how she talked to her children about success and career choices. The very next week, when Tyler expressed interest in taking an art class in addition to his advanced math program, Rebecca encouraged him instead of steering him toward more practical subjects. Art and design thinking could be really valuable. For an architect, she told him, Aunt Emma uses both technical skills and creative vision in her work. The shift extended beyond just supporting Tyler's new interests. Rebecca began incorporating lessons about different types of success into her conversations with all three boys. When Mason mentioned a classmate whose mother was a teacher, Rebecca talked about how educating children was one of the most important jobs in society, even if it didn't come with a high salary. When Connor expressed admiration for the janitor at his daycare who always had time to help the children, Rebecca explained how people who take care of others provide essential services that make communities stronger. These conversations represented a complete reversal of the messages she'd been sending for years. Instead of measuring worth only through wealth and status, she was helping her children understand that value comes from contributing to something larger than yourself. The changes in my nephews were equally profound. Tyler threw himself into learning about sustainable design with the same intensity he'd previously reserved for math competitions. He checked out books about green architecture from the library, started a compost bin in their backyard, and began sketching ideas for improving spaces around their neighborhood. Mason developed a fascination with the intersection of art and function, spending hours studying buildings in their town and photographing interesting architectural details. He started a photojournal documenting how different structures served their communities, from the elegant efficiency of their local library to the welcoming design of their pediatrician's office. Connor's interest manifested in more immediate ways. He began building elaborate structures with his blocks and Legos, always incorporating gardens, play areas, and spaces for different activities. His creations showed an intuitive understanding that buildings should serve people's needs, rather than just looking impressive. The ripple effects extended far beyond my immediate family. Word of the award spread through our extended network, reaching cousins, family friends, and community members who had absorbed Rebecca's narrative about my failed career over the years. The calls and messages of congratulation kept coming. For weeks, many from people who admitted they'd never really understood what I did for work. More importantly, the recognition opened new opportunities that aligned perfectly with my values and goals. The $50,000 prize money would fund the initial planning for 2 additional community centers, one in Detroit and another in rural Alabama. 3 universities invited me to speak about community-centered design. A major foundation asked me to consult on their affordable housing initiative. Each new opportunity reinforced the lesson that success doesn't have to look like what Rebecca had always envisioned. My career was thriving precisely because I'd chosen purpose over prestige, community impact over individual advancement. 6 months after the award ceremony, I was invited to Tyler's school for Career Day. Rebecca had volunteered me, something she never would have done before Chicago. As I set up my presentation in the 4th grade classroom, I couldn't help thinking about how different this moment felt from those painful family gatherings where she'd used me as a cautionary tale. The children listened with rapt attention as I explained how architects solve problems and help communities. I showed them pictures of the Bronx Community Center under construction, explaining how we'd incorporated the residents' ideas into the final design. When I described the rooftop garden, several students immediately started brainstorming ways to add growing spaces to their own school. "Questions?" I asked as my presentation concluded. 20 hands shot up immediately. The children wanted to know about everything from earthquake-resistant construction to designing buildings for people with disabilities. Their curiosity reminded me of Tyler's reaction at the award ceremony, that natural fascination with how things work and how they can be improved. But the question that touched me most came from a quiet girl in the back row. "Do you have to be really smart to be an architect?" "You have to be curious," I replied. "You have to care about other people and want to make their lives better. The technical skills can be learned, but the desire to help, that's what really matters." After my presentation, Tyler approached me with obvious pride. "Thank you for coming, Aunt Emma. Some of my friends said they want to be architects now, too." Rebecca, who had taken the afternoon off work to attend, overheard this exchange. The smile on her face was radiant with genuine happiness, so different from the forced expressions she'd worn during years of trying to manage my disappointing presence at family events. That evening, our family gathered for dinner at Rebecca's house, a regular occurrence that had resumed after years of tension. But now these gatherings felt completely different. Instead of deflecting questions about my work or minimizing my contributions to conversations, Rebecca actively encouraged her children to engage with me about architecture, design, and community development. The boys had started a tradition of showing me their latest building projects during these dinners. Tyler's designs had grown increasingly sophisticated, incorporating renewable energy concepts and accessibility features. Mason had begun documenting his architectural photography in a dedicated album, organizing his images by themes like community, gathering spaces, and sustainable design elements. Connor's block constructions had evolved into elaborate neighborhoods complete with schools, parks, and community centers. "Look what Uncle Marcus built at work," Rebecca said during one of these dinners, showing us photos of a luxury office building his firm had financed. "And look what Aunt Emma built," she continued, displaying pictures of the nearly completed Bronx Community Center side by side. The contrast was stark, but no longer carried judgment. Rebecca was helping her children understand that both types of projects had value, that success could be measured in different ways, that contributing to society didn't require conforming to a single definition of achievement. As I watched my nephews grow and develop their own interests and values, I realized that winning the Thornton Award had accomplished something far more important than professional recognition. It had freed an entire generation of my family from narrow definitions of worth and success. Tyler, Mason, and Connor were learning that they could pursue their passions without apologizing, that helping others was a worthy goal, that different people could contribute to the world in different ways. The woman who had once pointed at me and told her children, "This is what failure looks like," now introduced me to neighbors and friends as my sister, the award-winning architect. But more than changing how she talked about me, Rebecca had changed how she thought about success itself. She was raising her children to value contribution over accumulation, purpose over prestige, community over competition. Sometimes I think about that 8-year-old boy who used to build elaborate cities with his blocks before his mother convinced him that such activities weren't worthy of serious consideration. Tyler had found his way back to that curiosity, but now he had permission to pursue it seriously, to see it as a potential pathway to a meaningful career rather than just child's play. The Thornton Award had given me professional validation and opened new opportunities, but its greatest gift was returning my family to me and giving my nephews the freedom to become whoever they were meant to be. 2 years after the Thornton Award ceremony, I stood in the completed South Bronx Community Center watching Mrs. Santos teach a group of teenagers how to tend the rooftop garden. The tomatoes were thriving in the late afternoon sun, their red fruit hanging heavy on vines that seemed to reach toward the Manhattan skyline visible in the distance. The space buzzed with activity, children practicing piano in the music room, elderly residents playing dominoes in the social hall, parents attending a financial literacy workshop in the flexible classroom space. This building had become everything we'd envisioned and more. The solar panels generated enough energy to power the facility while selling excess electricity back to the grid, creating a revenue stream that funded additional programming. The job training program had helped 43 local residents find stable employment in construction and green technology. Most importantly, crime in the surrounding neighborhood had dropped by 30% since the center opened, as young people found safe spaces to gather and constructive activities to pursue. But the most profound changes weren't reflected in statistics or energy output measurements. They were visible in moments like this one, watching Mrs. Santos pass on gardening knowledge to teenagers who had never imagined they could grow their own food, seeing elderly residents regain their sense of community and purpose, witnessing children discover talents they never knew they possessed. "Miss Emma," called out Jamal, a 16-year-old who'd been skeptical of the center when it first opened. He was now one of Mrs. Santos's most dedicated gardening assistants and planned to study agricultural engineering in college. "The peppers are ready. For harvesting. Want to see what we grew?" These interactions had become the real measure of the project's success. The building wasn't just serving the community, it was transforming it, creating connections between generations and opportunities for growth that extended far beyond its walls. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler, now 10 years old and deep, into his own architectural education. "Aunt Emma, can you FaceTime tonight? I want to show you the model I built for our town's new library. I used your sustainable design principles." The enthusiasm in his message made me smile. Tyler's passion for environmentally conscious design had only grown stronger over the past 2 years. He'd started a recycling program at his school, designed a rainwater collection system for his mother's garden, and spent countless hours sketching improvements for public spaces around their suburb. Most remarkably, Rebecca not only supported these interests, but actively encouraged them. "He's becoming quite the little activist," she'd told me proudly during our last family dinner. "Last week he presented a proposal to the town council for adding solar panels to the elementary school. They're actually considering it." The transformation in Rebecca herself continued to astound me. The sister who had once dismissed community service as unrealistic idealism now volunteered regularly at a local nonprofit that provided housing assistance to low-income families. She'd used her organizational skills and social connections to raise significant funds for their programs, approaching the work with the same intensity she'd once reserved for competitive parenting. "I never understood how much impact you could have working with people who really need help," she'd explained during one of our long conversations about her volunteer work. "I spent so many years focused on accumulating things that didn't really matter. This feels so much more meaningful." Mason, now 7, had developed his architectural photography into a serious hobby. His images had evolved from simple documentation to artistic interpretations that captured the emotional essence of different spaces. He'd recently started a project photographing public buildings in their area, creating a visual essay about how design choices affected how people felt in different environments. "Look at this shot of the post office," he'd shown me during my last visit, pointing to a photograph that emphasized the building's cold, institutional feel. See how the lighting makes people look sad? Now look at this one from the children's library. The second image glowed with warm, natural light, showing children curled up in cozy reading nooks designed specifically for young users. His work showed an intuitive understanding of architecture's psychological impact that impressed even my professional colleagues. Dr. Chen, who had stayed in touch since the Thornton ceremony, invited Mason to contribute some of his photographs to an academic paper she was writing about child-friendly public spaces. Connor, now 7 years old, had channeled his building enthusiasm into advocacy for better playgrounds in their community. His innocent questions about why some parks had newer equipment than others had led to family discussions about equity and resource allocation that would have been unthinkable during Rebecca's previous worldview. "It's not fair that kids in some neighborhoods have better playgrounds," he'd announced during a family barbecue. "Someone should design good ones for everyone." Rebecca had taken his concern seriously, researching playground funding and discovering significant disparities between wealthy and working-class communities in their area. She joined a regional coalition working to address these inequities, bringing her fundraising skills to support playground improvements in underserved neighborhoods. These changes in my nephews reflected a broader shift in how they understood their place in the world. Instead of seeing themselves as inherently deserving of advantages others lacked, they were learning to recognize systemic inequalities and think about how they could contribute to solutions. The professional opportunities that followed the Thornton Award had exceeded my wildest expectations. The Detroit Community Center project was nearing completion, incorporating lessons learned from the Bronx while addressing the specific needs of that community. The Rural Alabama project had evolved into a broader initiative supporting economic development in former coal mining regions. 3 major universities had offered me visiting professorships, positions that would allow me to teach the next generation of architects about community-centered design while continuing my practice. The documentary about the Bronx project had won 2 film festival awards and was being distributed to architecture schools worldwide. But perhaps the most gratifying recognition came from an unexpected source. The mayor of Westfield, Rebecca's own affluent suburb, had reached out about designing a new community center that would serve residents across all income levels. The existing facilities catered primarily to families who could afford membership fees and program costs, leaving out working-class residents who couldn't access services available in neighboring communities. "We've been following your work since the Thornton Award," Mayor Williams explained during our initial meeting. "Several residents have advocated for a more inclusive approach to community programming, and we think your design philosophy could help us create something special." The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being asked to bring the principles Rebecca had once dismissed as impractical to her own community. But what made the project even more meaningful was that Rebecca herself had been one of the advocates pushing for more inclusive community services. "I kept thinking about what you said at the award ceremony," she told me when I shared the news about the Westfield project. "About architects' responsibility to serve everyone, not just people who can afford luxury amenities. Our town has resources, and we should be using them to help everyone thrive." The preliminary meetings for the Westfield project revealed needs that surprised many of the more affluent residents. Single parents working multiple jobs needed affordable after-school care. Elderly residents on fixed incomes required accessible programming and transportation assistance. Teenagers from all economic backgrounds lacked safe spaces to gather and positive activities to pursue. Tyler attended several of these community meetings, taking notes with the seriousness of a professional consultant. His questions during the public comment periods were often more insightful than those posed by adult residents. "Why don't we have any programs that bring different age groups together?" he asked during one session. At Aunt Emma's building in the Bronx, the teenagers help the older people with technology, and the older people teach the teenagers about gardening. Everyone learns from each other. His observations helped shape the design direction, emphasizing intergenerational programming, and flexible spaces that could accommodate diverse activities. The project became a collaboration between my firm and the community, with residents contributing ideas throughout the design process. Mason documented these meetings through his photography, creating a visual record of community engagement that would be incorporated into the final presentation materials. His images captured the excitement and hope in residents' faces as they described their vision for a more inclusive community space. Connor's contribution was less formal but equally valuable. During a site visit to the proposed location, he pointed out natural features that adult planners had overlooked: a grove of mature oak trees that provided natural shade, a slight slope that could be transformed into an amphitheater for outdoor programs, a seasonal stream that could become an educational feature for environmental programming. Kids notice different things than grown-ups, he explained to the design team. We see places to play and explore that you might not think about. His insights reminded everyone involved that effective community design required input from users of all ages, not just the adults who typically dominated planning processes. The Westfield project also provided an opportunity to demonstrate how sustainable design principles could be adapted for different economic contexts. While the Bronx Center had emphasized affordability and resource efficiency, Westfield's larger budget allowed for innovative technologies that could serve as demonstrations for other communities. We incorporated geothermal heating and cooling systems, advanced solar installations, and rainwater management features that would make the building a net positive energy producer. These systems would not only reduce operating costs, but serve as educational tools, showing residents how environmental technologies could be integrated into community infrastructure. The design process became a learning experience for my entire family. Rebecca attended public meetings and contributed valuable insights about programming needs based on her volunteer work with housing assistance. Her understanding of the challenges facing working families informed discussions about accessibility and affordability. A few years ago, I would have focused only on making sure the building looked impressive, she admitted during one of our planning sessions. Now I'm thinking about whether a single mother working 2 jobs can actually use these services, whether the programming schedule works for people with unpredictable work hours, whether the building feels welcoming to people who might feel intimidated by fancy facilities. The transformation in her perspective was complete. The woman who had once measured success only through material accumulation now evaluated projects based on their social impact and accessibility to vulnerable populations. As construction began, on the Westfield Center, I often found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this point. The sister who had once pointed at me as an example of failure was now collaborating with me on a project that would serve thousands of people for decades to come. Her children, who had been taught to see my work as insignificant, were now contributing meaningfully to community development initiatives. But the most profound change was in how they understood success itself. Tyler talked about wanting to design buildings that would help solve climate change. Mason hoped to use photography to document social issues and advocate for positive change. Connor dreamed of creating playgrounds that would bring children from different backgrounds together. None of them spoke about success in terms of accumulating wealth or achieving status symbols. Instead, they measured worth through contribution and impact, values that would guide them toward meaningful careers regardless of which specific paths they chose. The Thornton Award had given me professional recognition and opened new opportunities, but its greatest gift was transforming my family's understanding of what it meant to live a successful life. We'd all learned that true achievement comes not from impressing others, but from improving the world around us. Standing in that completed community center in the Bronx, watching children and elders learn from each other in spaces designed specifically for connection and growth, I realized that this was what architecture was supposed to accomplish. Not monuments to designers' egos, but foundations for stronger communities. And in my own family, we'd built new foundations too. Relationships based on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that everyone has something valuable to contribute. The little boy who used to build elaborate cities with his blocks was now designing real solutions for real problems, supported by a mother who had learned to value purpose over prestige. That, more than any award or recognition, represented the true measure of success. 5 years after that transformative evening in Chicago, I found myself standing in another ballroom, this one filled with the next generation of architects, urban planners, and community development specialists. The annual Student Design Awards ceremony at Columbia University had invited me as the keynote speaker, a role that still felt surreal despite the recognition my work had received over the past few years. But tonight was different. In the third row, Tyler sat with his 8th grade classmates from the Regional Gifted Program, attending as part of a field trip Rebecca had organized. At 13, he'd already won 2 state-level competitions for sustainable design innovations and had been accepted into a summer architecture program at MIT. His latest project, a proposal for converting abandoned shopping malls into mixed-use community hubs, had caught the attention of several urban planning professors. Mason, now 9, was documenting the event with a professional-grade camera Rebecca had bought him for his birthday. His architectural photography had evolved from a hobby into serious artistic work, with several of his images featured in a traveling exhibition about child-friendly public spaces. Tonight, he was working on a photo essay about young people in architecture, capturing the energy and idealism of the student designers. Connor, at 9 years old, had surprised everyone by starting a nonprofit organization called Playgrounds for All. What began as a child's concern about playground inequity had grown into a legitimate advocacy group that had successfully lobbied for playground improvements in 12 communities across New Jersey. He was the youngest person ever invited to speak at the state legislature about municipal park funding. Rebecca sat beside her children, radiating pride, but also a quiet confidence that came from her own accomplishments. Her volunteer work had evolved into a full-time position as director of community outreach for a regional housing nonprofit. She'd returned to school part-time to earn a master's degree in social work, approaching her studies with the same intensity she'd once devoted to competitive mothering. As I looked out at the audience of aspiring architects and current students, I thought about how to convey the lessons I'd learned not just from the Thornton Award, but from the years of family transformation that followed. These young people were entering a profession that could either perpetuate inequality through exclusive, ego-driven design, or help build more just communities through thoughtful, inclusive architecture. When I was your age, I began, I thought success meant designing buildings that would make other architects notice me. I wanted to create structures that would be featured in magazines and win prestigious awards. And while recognition has its place, I've learned that the most meaningful architecture is often invisible to the design establishment. I clicked to a slide showing the South Bronx Community Center on a typical afternoon. Children playing in the rooftop garden, teenagers recording music in the studio, elderly residents teaching traditional crafts to younger generations. The building itself looked modest compared to the gleaming towers and sculptural museums that usually dominated architectural presentations. This building will never be called a masterpiece. It won't appear in design textbooks or inspire pilgrimages from architecture students, but it has fundamentally changed a neighborhood, created opportunities for thousands of people, and demonstrated that thoughtful design can address real social problems. Tyler raised his hand during the question period that followed. Aunt Emma, how do you convince clients to invest in community-centered design when they could make more money with luxury developments? His question sparked a broader discussion about the economics of ethical architecture, the role of public funding in community development, and strategies for making social impact financially sustainable. The conversation continued long after the formal presentation ended, with students gathering around our family to discuss specific projects and career paths. What struck me most about these interactions was how naturally Tyler, Mason, and Connor participated in complex discussions about urban planning, environmental justice, and community engagement. They'd grown up understanding these concepts not as abstract academic theories, but as practical approaches to solving real problems. Later that evening, at the reception following the ceremony, Dr. Chen approached our group. She'd become a mentor to Tyler, corresponding with him regularly about his design projects and encouraging his interest in environmental architecture. "Your nephew's shopping mall conversion proposal is quite sophisticated," she told Rebecca. "He's thinking about economic sustainability, community programming, and environmental impact in ways that challenge many graduate students. Have you considered that he might be ready for more advanced coursework?" Rebecca's response reflected how completely her priorities had shifted. "We want to make sure he has a well-rounded education," she said. "He's involved in community organizing, volunteers with Connor's playground advocacy work, and helps coordinate environmental education programs at the community center Emma designed. The technical skills are important, but understanding how to work with communities matters just as much." This conversation highlighted one of the most significant changes in Rebecca's parenting philosophy. Instead of pushing her children toward narrowly defined academic excellence, she now encouraged them to develop diverse skills and broad perspectives. Tyler was learning Spanish to better communicate with residents in communities where he volunteered. Mason studied sociology alongside art to understand how built environments affected social dynamics. Connor was taking public speaking classes to improve his advocacy skills. The drive home from the university gave us time for the kind of deep, family conversation that had become common since the Thornton Award ceremony. The boys were processing what they'd learned from the presentations and workshops, connecting new concepts to their ongoing projects and interests. "I want to design buildings that help fight climate change," Tyler announced from the back seat. "But I also want to make sure they serve communities that have been ignored by traditional architecture." "What if you could do both?" Rebecca suggested. "Maybe buildings that demonstrate environmental technologies while providing essential services to underserved populations?" Her question showed how thoroughly she now understood the intersection of social justice and environmental sustainability. The woman who had once dismissed such concerns as impractical idealism was now helping her teenage son develop sophisticated approaches to complex societal problems. Mason had been quiet during the early part of the drive, reviewing his photographs from the event. "I want to document how architecture affects people's daily lives," he said eventually. "Not just pretty buildings, but how design choices impact whether people feel welcome, whether they can access services, whether they feel proud of their neighborhoods." His artistic vision had matured considerably over the past few years. Recent projects included a photo series about accessibility in public buildings, documentation of community gardens in urban food deserts, and portraits of residents in affordable housing developments that challenged stereotypes about low-income communities. Connor's contribution to the conversation was characteristically direct. "When I grow up, I want to make sure every kid has a good place to play, no matter how much money their parents have." His playground advocacy work had taught him about municipal budgeting, grant writing, and coalition building, skills that would serve him well regardless of his eventual career path. More importantly, he'd learned that children could be effective advocates for themselves and their communities when adults were willing to listen and support their efforts. The following weekend brought our monthly family dinner, a tradition that had evolved significantly since the early days when Rebecca used these gatherings to reinforce her children's sense of superiority over their unsuccessful aunt. Now these meals were collaborative affairs where everyone contributed to cooking, conversations ranged across diverse topics, and the boys shared updates on their various projects and interests. Tyler had exciting news to share. His shopping mall conversion proposal had been selected for presentation at a national conference on adaptive reuse and sustainable development. At 13, he would be the youngest presenter in the conference's history. "The organizers want me to discuss how young people see urban development differently than adults," he explained. "They think our perspectives might help architects design spaces that work better for future generations." Rebecca glowed with pride, but her response focused on the opportunity's broader implications rather than personal achievement. This could be a great platform for talking about climate resilience and social equity, she suggested. You have a chance to influence how professionals think about community-centered design. Mason had his own announcement. A national architecture magazine had commissioned him to photograph community-centered buildings across the country, creating a visual essay about architecture's social impact. The assignment would take him to 12 cities over the summer, documenting projects that prioritized community service over aesthetic innovation. They want to show readers that beautiful architecture doesn't have to be exclusive, he explained. Buildings can be both visually striking and socially responsible. His work would complement written articles about architects like me who were challenging traditional approaches to design practice. The magazine was dedicating an entire issue to community-centered architecture, reflecting growing interest in socially conscious design among both professionals and the general public. Connor's update was equally impressive for a 9-year-old. Playgrounds for All had received a major grant to expand their advocacy work to 3 additional states. The funding would allow them to hire adult staff members while maintaining Connor as the organization's youth spokesperson and primary advocate. We're going to help kids in other places start their own playground campaigns, he explained. I'll teach them how to talk to grown-ups about what they need in their neighborhoods. His organization had become a model for youth advocacy that was being studied by child development experts and community organizers. Connor's ability to articulate complex issues in accessible language had made him an effective spokesperson for children's environmental justice concerns. As dinner concluded, I reflected on how dramatically our family dynamics had changed. These gatherings once left me feeling diminished and defensive, questioning my own choices and achievements. Now they energized me, surrounded as I was by family members who shared my values and supported each other's efforts to contribute positively to society. The transformation had extended beyond my immediate family. Our parents, who had once worried about my impractical career choices, now bragged to their friends about their architect daughter and their grandchildren's advocacy work. Extended family members who had absorbed Rebecca's narrative about my failure were now asking for advice about community engagement and sustainable living. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from unexpected sources. Mrs. Santos, now 82 and still tending the community center garden, had become something of a celebrity in architectural circles. Her presentations about community engagement had influenced dozens of design projects across the country. You taught architects to listen, she'd told me during a recent visit to the Bronx Center. Now other communities have buildings that actually serve their needs instead of just looking impressive. The South Bronx Community Center had become a pilgrimage site for architecture students and professionals interested in community-centered design. Tours were booked months in advance, with visitors coming from around the world to study our approach to community engagement and sustainable construction. More importantly, the building continued to evolve with its community's changing needs. The flexible design we'd incorporated allowed for programming adjustments that kept the center relevant and useful. New partnerships had been formed, additional services had been added, and the resident-led programming had grown increasingly sophisticated. Similar transformations were happening at the other projects I'd completed since the Thornton Award. The Detroit Center had sparked neighborhood revitalization that attracted additional investment and development. The Rural Alabama project had become a catalyst for economic diversification in former coal mining communities. The Westfield Center had demonstrated that affluent suburbs could successfully serve residents across all income levels. Each project built on lessons learned from previous work, creating a portfolio of community-centered architecture that was influencing design practice far beyond my own firm. Several architecture schools had incorporated our community engagement methodologies into their curricula. Professional organizations were developing new standards for social impact assessment in design projects. As I tucked Connor into bed that night, he asked a question that crystallized everything our family had learned over the past 5 years. Aunt, Emma, do you think we changed because you won that award? Or did you win the award because we were ready to change? His question revealed sophisticated thinking about causation and personal growth that would have been impossible before our family's transformation. But more than that, it showed how completely he understood that meaningful change requires both external recognition and internal readiness to grow. I think we helped each other become who we were meant to be, I replied. Sometimes it takes a big moment like an award ceremony to help people see what was already there. Looking back on the journey from that painful birthday party where Rebecca first labeled me a failure to this moment of mutual support and shared purpose, I realized that the Thornton Award had been less about vindication than about liberation. It freed all of us from narrow definitions of success and allowed us to pursue meaningful work that aligned with our values. Tyler was becoming the kind of architect who would prioritize community impact over personal recognition. Mason was developing into an artist who would use his talents to advocate for social justice. Connor was learning that even children could be effective agents of positive change, and Rebecca had transformed from someone who measured worth through material accumulation into someone who found fulfillment through service to others. Her children were growing up understanding that true success comes from contributing to something larger than yourself. The little boy who once built elaborate cities with his blocks was now designing real solutions for real problems, supported by a family that valued purpose over prestige, community over competition, and contribution over accumulation. That transformation, more than any award or professional recognition, represented the true measure of a life well lived. We'd all learned that success isn't about impressing others, it's about improving the world around us, one building, one photograph, one playground, one family at a time. 10 years had passed since that life-changing moment in Chicago when I held the Thornton Award and saw my nephews cheering in the audience. Now, standing in the boardroom of Henderson Community Design, the firm Rebecca and I had founded together, I watched Tyler present his senior thesis project to a panel of distinguished architects and community leaders. At 18, Tyler had grown into a confident young man whose passion for environmental architecture was matched by his commitment to social justice. His thesis proposed a network of climate-resilient community centers across the Gulf Coast, designed to serve as both everyday gathering spaces and emergency shelters during increasingly frequent hurricanes. Traditional disaster planning treats communities as passive recipients of aid, Tyler explained to the panel, his presentation style eerily reminiscent of my own approach years earlier. This design framework empowers residents to become active participants in both disaster preparedness and community building. Rebecca sat beside me, tears streaming down her face as she watched her eldest son articulate complex ideas about resilience, equity, and environmental justice. The woman who had once dismissed such concepts as impractical idealism was now co-directing a firm dedicated to community-centered design. "I still can't believe he's only 18, she whispered. "When I think about what I was prioritizing at his age." Her voice trailed off, but I knew she was thinking about the years she'd spent focused solely on status and accumulation. The transformation in her values had been so complete that she sometimes seemed shocked by her former priorities. Mason, now 14, was documenting Tyler's presentation with the skill of a seasoned professional photographer. His work had been featured in major architecture publications, and he'd recently signed with a gallery for his first solo exhibition about architecture's impact on community mental health. His images told stories that complemented the buildings his family designed, showing how thoughtful spaces could heal and inspire. Connor, at 14, was taking notes on Tyler's presentation with the intensity of someone planning his own future projects. His Playgrounds for All organization had evolved into a national network that had successfully advocated for playground improvements in over 200 communities. He was already being recruited by colleges interested in his unique combination of activism and organizational leadership. The presentation concluded with thunderous applause from the panel. Dr. Chen, who had followed our family's journey since that first award ceremony, stood to offer her commentary. "Tyler's work represents the future of architecture," she said. "He understands that buildings are not just aesthetic objects, but tools for social change. This project demonstrates technical excellence while addressing urgent social and environmental challenges." Her words echoed similar praise Tyler had received throughout his high school career. MIT had already accepted him for early admission, offering a full scholarship for his undergraduate studies. But what impressed me most wasn't his academic achievements. It was his unwavering commitment to using architecture as a force for positive change. After the presentation, our family gathered at the community center I'd designed in Westfield, which had become a second home for all of us. The building buzzed with activity. Children attended after-school programs in spaces Tyler had helped design during a summer internship. Teenagers worked on art projects in studios Mason had documented for his photography portfolio. And elderly residents participated in fitness classes in rooms Connor had advocated for during the initial planning process. "Remember when you first brought us here during construction?" Mason asked, adjusting his camera settings to capture the golden hour, light streaming through the building's carefully positioned windows. "I thought it was just another boring building project. I had no idea how much it would change everything." His observations sparked a conversation about how our understanding of architecture's purpose had evolved over the decade. Tyler talked about early visits to the Bronx Center, where he'd first understood that buildings could address social problems. Mason described learning to see beyond a structure's visual appeal to understand its impact on daily life. Connor recalled the moment. He realized that advocacy could transform abstract ideas into concrete improvements. "What I remember most," Rebecca said, "was the day I finally understood that Emma wasn't the family failure. I was the one who had failed to understand what really mattered." Her honesty still surprised me sometimes. The sister who had once been incapable of admitting mistakes now spoke openly about her previous misconceptions and the journey that had led to her current perspective. Henderson Community Design had grown from our partnership into a nationally recognized firm specializing in community-centered projects. We'd completed 43 buildings across 12 states, each designed through extensive community engagement and focused on addressing local needs. The firm's success had attracted talented architects who shared our values, creating a workplace culture that prioritized impact over profit. But our most important project was still in development. Tyler's hurricane-resilient community center proposal had caught the attention of federal disaster preparedness officials, who were considering funding a pilot program based on his design. If approved, it would be the first time a teenager's architectural vision had influenced national policy. "The beauty of Tyler's approach," explained Sarah Martinez, our firm's newest partner and a specialist in climate-adaptive design, "is that it treats communities as assets rather than victims. These centers would strengthen neighborhoods during normal times while providing essential services during emergencies." The federal interest in Tyler's work reflected broader changes in how the architecture profession approached community development. The principles we'd championed for over a decade, community engagement, social equity, environmental sustainability, were becoming standard practice rather than radical innovations. Mrs. Santos, now 87 but still sharp as ever, had become something of a legend in architectural circles. Her presentations about community participation in design had influenced hundreds of projects worldwide. She'd been invited to speak at universities, consulted on international development projects, and received honorary degrees from 3 institutions. "You know what I'm proudest of?" she asked during our recent visit to the Bronx Center. "Not the awards or recognition, but watching young people like Tyler understand that architecture is about serving others. That's the real legacy." Her words captured something essential about what our family had learned over the past decade. Success wasn't measured by individual achievements or external recognition, but by the positive impact we could have on others and the values we passed on to future generations. Tyler's acceptance speech at his high school graduation had moved everyone in attendance. Instead of focusing on his own accomplishments, he'd talked about the responsibility his generation had to address climate change and social inequality through thoughtful design and community engagement. "My aunt taught me that architecture isn't about building monuments to ourselves," he'd said. "It's about creating spaces where people can thrive, where communities can heal, where the future can be better than the past." After the ceremony, a younger student approached him with questions about pursuing architecture. The conversation reminded me of my own interactions with Tyler at that age, when Rebecca was still trying to steer him away from impractical interests. Now, Rebecca actively encouraged such conversations, understanding that inspiring the next generation was part of our professional responsibility. She'd established a scholarship program for students from underserved communities who wanted to study architecture, urban planning, or community development. "I want to make sure talented young people have opportunities regardless of their economic background," she'd explained when announcing the program. "For too many years, I thought success meant keeping advantages to ourselves. Now, I understand it means sharing opportunities with others." As Tyler prepared to leave for college, our family reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The painful birthday party where Rebecca had first labeled me a failure seemed like something from another lifetime. The woman who had once used me as a cautionary tale for her children was now my business partner and closest collaborator. The boys had grown into young men who understood that their privileges came with responsibilities, that their talents should be used to serve others, that success meant contributing to something larger than themselves. They'd learned these lessons not through lectures or punishments, but by watching adults in their lives model these values consistently. "I'm going to miss having you around the office," I told Tyler during one of our last design sessions before his departure. "But I'm excited to see what you'll create when you're working with new ideas and perspectives." His response revealed the maturity that had developed through years of meaningful work and family support. "I'll always carry the foundation you and Mom built for me," he said. "But now it's time to see what I can add to it." That evening, as our family shared dinner in the community center's multi-purpose room, a space that had hosted thousands of meals, meetings, and celebrations over the past decade, I thought about the unexpected path that had led us here. The Thornton Award had been a catalyst, but the real transformation had come through daily choices to prioritize community over competition, service over status, collaboration over individual achievement. We'd all learned that changing the world starts with changing ourselves, that success means lifting others up rather than putting them down. Rebecca raised her glass for a toast. To Emma, who showed us what real success looks like. To Tyler, Mason, and Connor, who are carrying that vision forward. And to all the communities we've had the privilege to serve. As we clinked glasses in that beautiful, bustling space filled with families from across the economic spectrum, I realized that this was what I'd been building toward all along. Not just physical structures, but relationships based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Not just individual achievement, but collective progress toward a more just and sustainable world. The little boy who had once built cities with blocks was now preparing to design real solutions for urgent global challenges. The sister who had once seen me as a failure was now my most trusted partner. The nephews who had been taught to look down on community service were now dedicated to serving others. Sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones that get public recognition. Sometimes they happen quietly, in family conversations and changed perspectives. In children who grow up understanding that their worth comes from what they contribute rather than what they accumulate. As I looked around the table at my family, architects and advocates and artists united by love and shared values, I knew that this was the legacy that mattered most. Not buildings or awards, but people who would carry forward the understanding that architecture, like life itself, is about creating spaces where everyone can thrive. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.